Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this Catholic Truth podcast. We're so excited that you are joining us today. Catholic Truth is a nonprofit organization that does apologetics and evangelization and helps Catholics to know, love, and live their faith, and even to defend it. The faith that has come down to us from Jesus and the apostles over 2,000 years. And we are so passionate about it, and we hope to inspire you and set your faith on fire as well. Today, we are going to be talking about a fantastic topic, one that is highly misunderstood in our country and in just society in general, and that is called the Inquisition. It's one of the big ones. It's called revisionist history. And it's one of those things where most people, I would say, have no idea what the Inquisition was actually about, the details of the Inquisition, what happened at the Inquisition. And many people just repeat myths that they've heard from other people. And just because we repeat things and hear things over and over and over again does not make them true. And so in this podcast, we're going to be discussing with Stephen WEIDENKOPF, who is a historian and a lecturer on church history. He has many expertise, including the Crusades and the Inquisition, and he lectures all around the country and in person and on the radio, including EWTN, Catholic Answers, and many more. And Stephen is known for Epic, which is a 20 DVD set talking about the history of the church. He has many books, including The Real Story of Catholic History, answering 20 centuries of anti-Catholic myths. And also, he wrote the book, A History of the Catholic Church, among many others. And his newest book is Light from Darkness. 9 times the Catholic Church was in turmoil and came out stronger than before. And I would love to have a whole episode with Steve just on this topic, because many people think that just because the Catholic Church is in a crisis, this is the first crisis that we've ever faced, and it's the biggest crisis we've ever been. And that is far from true. We have faced so many crises in this 2,000 years that we've had, and we've come through them stronger than before. And so Steve goes through them all, and I would ask you all to check out his book, Light from Darkness. And some of them were the Albigensian heresy, the Enlightenment, so-called 3 popes at one time, and many, many more objections that people have to the Catholic Church and history. So without further ado, I'm very excited to invite and welcome Steve WEIDENKOPF to the show. Thank you for joining us, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I appreciate you having me on the show to talk about this important, misunderstood historical topic.
Very misunderstood. Probably up there with the Crusades and 3 popes and a few others. But since many people misunderstand the Inquisition, they have a lot of misconceptions. Could you paint a picture before we even get started of what many people think the Inquisition is and what many people think the Vatican and the Catholic Church and their involvement with the Inquisition is?
Yeah, absolutely. The Inquisition is, like you mentioned, many of these other historical topics that has wide-ranging knowledge in terms of people are aware of the word or the term. So if you walk into a room full of people and you say the Inquisition, right? I mean, people are going to have a sense or an image in their mind of, if you will, of what that was or what they think it was, right? Many people might immediately start breaking into song from Mel Brooks's History of the World Part 1 and sing that famous song that he, the Inquisition, yada, yada. I'm not going to sing it because I'm a horrible singer, but they'll think of that, or they'll think of the Monty Python skit about the Spanish Inquisition, which no one expects. But, so again, a topic like the Crusades and others that has a recognition, at least of the word and an image of what people think it is, but again, very misunderstood. So I think what most people think about the Inquisition when they hear the word is they think of this time when, in the Dark Ages, so-called, or the Middle Ages, where the Catholic Church was this all-powerful, omniscient organization that oppressed the ability of Europeans to think freely and to practice their faith freely and free from oppression. And it was this horrific tribunal that tortured and killed millions of people simply because they didn't believe what the Catholic Church taught. That's I think the kind of general picture that people have that's been painted, as you mentioned, by all these different historical myths that have been perpetuated through the centuries. So that today in modernity, that's what people have in their mind of the image of the Inquisition.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was from your talk or from a talk that I heard, had spoken about, a large spy network and, hunting down people of other religions who refused to submit to Rome and convert to Catholicism. And they would take these people and they would torture them until they died or converted. And just so many myths and misconceptions about it. But what are some of, we're going to go into these in more depth, but what are some of the top myths that people hold about the Inquisition?
Yeah, we touched on a few just a minute ago, right? But so people think that the Institute or the Inquisition was some kind of monolithic, all-encompassing, powerful organization that the church operated, transnationally, if you will, or across all the boundaries and borders of Europe, again, to control and suppress thought and freedom of expression. People also believe, or another major myth of the Inquisition is that it utilized torture, that you had these kind of sadistic monks that went around finding people, hunting down people, as you mentioned, who believed differently from the church, and abused them, tortured them, killed them, went after Jews, after witches, after Muslims, after anybody that didn't, even Protestants, anybody that believed different from the church. You had these horrible Dominican monks who went around, rounding people up and torturing and killing them. And then, one of the bigger myths, I think, too, that people frequently believe is that the Inquisition was responsible for the witch hunts and the witch craze that swept Europe as well, and even onto the shores of the New World in Massachusetts and other places.
Wait, so none of that ever happened?
No.
Okay. So let's talk about that then. The Spanish Inquisition. So what is it then? What does the word Spanish, or I should say Inquisition, mean? And just for our viewers, there were many inquisitions that happened throughout Europe at different times, over different centuries, in different places, even non-Catholic inquisitions, for the record. But what most people commonly mistake and think of first and have the most misconceptions about is the Spanish Inquisition. So just for our viewers, that's the one we're going to focus in on today. And maybe we'll have another one in the future of different inquisitions. But just for this show, we're going to focus on primarily the Spanish Inquisition. So if you wouldn't mind starting by telling us just what the word Inquisition means, who started it, why.
Yeah. So, sure. So, you rightly point out that when we talk, there is no single kind of inquisition, right? That's one of the first myths to disabuse people of, is that somehow there was this, one day in time, the Pope decreed there's going to be an inquisition, and it was this monolithic organization that controlled everything all throughout Christendom, for centuries. That sort of thing never existed, right? So you really have to distinguish. There's kind of two phases of what we could call the Inquisition, if you will. There was the initial phase, which was really in the later 12th century and more specifically into the 13th century, where you have a better phrase to use instead of Inquisition would be medieval inquisitors. So this was a period of time where you had papally appointed inquisitors who were charged with combating heresy and with ensuring the eradication of heresy in various areas of Christendom. It begins really in the south of France with the Albigensian heresy in the 13th century. And it was designed to be by the church to be an ecclesial tribunal that investigated using inquisitorial procedure, meaning you would have the collection of evidence, you would bring witnesses before the tribunal, including the accused, who would give their testimony, and then you had trained individuals, these trained papal inquisitors, who would go through and would investigate and would ask questions of people and gather evidence, gather testimony, review it, and then pass judgment on the person who was accused of heresy. And that whole thing was designed, to give context leading up to the Spanish Inquisition, that whole thing was designed in order by the church to take kind of control, if you will, of the investigation of heresy. And so why would they need to do that? Well, previous to this time, heresy was investigated by secular authorities. And secular authorities were charged with the prosecution of heresy, and they obviously were not trained theologians. So you couldn't expect a nobleman to understand if a Waldensian was saying something that was heresy or if it was something that was Orthodox Catholic doctrine. So the Pope and bishops wanted to take that investigation out of the hands of secular authorities and place it into the hands of trained papal inquisitors, right? So that's where you have the establishment of this. And then eventually, as you go through the centuries in time, when you get to the 15th century, you begin to have the creation of institutional tribunals. So initially, I should say, during the period of the medieval inquisitors, this was an itinerant process, right? So that it wasn't one area or one place where the inquisitors were. They traveled around from region to region where heresy was suspected. There wasn't anything that was institutionalized at that point. Later on in the 15th century, especially in Spain, which we'll talk more in detail now about, you have the establishment of institutional tribunals. And these were not just in Spain, but in other areas of Europe as well, usually centered in major urban areas where the institution of the Inquisition was rather established. So in various towns. And those existed from the 15th century all the way up until the 19th century. And the very last one actually was the Holy Office of the Inquisition in Rome, which was then eventually still exists today, except as a result of the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. It was changed, the name of it, from the Holy Office of the Inquisition to the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. So that office still exists, if you will, and still in charge with ensuring doctrinal orthodoxy in the church today. But in Spain, what you have is you had a unique situation in Christendom in Spain in the 15th century. Spain was unique as a whole within Christendom. It was the one area of Christian Europe where you had, the three great monotheistic faiths, if you will, living together and had been for centuries. So you had Muslims, you had Jews, you had Christians all living in this territory for a long period of time, right? Muslims had invaded Spain in the 8th century, had conquered most of it, frankly, during the Reconquista, which was a 770 plus year war, where Christians were able to liberate the Muslim occupied territory and reconquer and reincorporate this Christian area and Christian territory into what we know as modern day Spain and Portugal. But that last conquest didn't happen until the end of the 15th century. So that's the backdrop to what's going on in Spain. And so what happens is you have a lot of people in Spain who descend from Jewish families, descend from Muslim families, who convert and become Christian. And some do so authentically, right? They honestly believed and became converts and became Catholic. But then you had some groups too who were perhaps not they converted for societal reasons, right? You couldn't advance in Spanish society in the 15th century unless you were Catholic, right? You couldn't hold certain jobs. Society was structured that way. And so there were some people, or at least some Spanish Christians, believed that some of these conversos, they were known as, from Muslim and Jewish families, maybe they weren't really Christian. Maybe publicly they said they were Christian and seemed Christian and looked Christian and practiced the faith publicly, but in secret, they were different, right? They still held to their Jewish faith, or they still held to the Muslim faith. And so there was this widespread belief in Spanish society, which actually isn't really much borne out by the historical record, but there was kind of this conspiratorial belief in this fifth element, if you will, or fifth column in Spanish society, where you have all these conversos who were still secretly Jewish and still secretly Muslim, and they were a threat to Spanish society. They were a threat to the unification of Spain. They were a threat to the crown and to the monarchy of Queen Isabel and King Fernando. So Fernando and Isabel petitioned the Pope, Sixtus IV, in the late 15th century to establish a tribunal known as the Inquisition, an institutional tribunal in Spanish society, to investigate the conversos and to investigate issues of heresy and other matters.
Can I jump in for a second? I have a
Please.
quick question on that. You said it was a threat to the crown and a possible threat to the king and queen themselves. Why is that? What was happening, or what were they afraid of?
Well, the belief was, so again, the backdrop is this unification of the country. The last Muslim stronghold in Granada in 1492 had finally been liberated by Fernando and Isabel. And so you still had various elements within Spanish society that held to the belief that some of these newly converted Muslims and Jews were still secretly Muslim and Jews, right? So that they would, if a Muslim army was to come back into Spain, they would open the gates of a city, for example, and allow this invading army in. So there was some element of that. There was a concern. There was also a lot of, frankly, some animosity by these what were called old Christians, so Spanish families who had been Christian for generations. They were somewhat envious of some of these conversos who had risen prominently in positions of authority and power in the government and in other areas of Spanish society. And so this was an opportunity for them to kind of cast doubt on these newly converted individuals and to lessen their influence in Spanish society as well. So there's a lot of, conspiracy theories. There's a lot of misunderstandings. There's a lot of, otherness and foreigners and, scared individuals in Spain that kind of all contribute to this element, or if you will, this belief in Spanish society, which led the crown to request this tribunal from the Pope. And also, too, one could argue that the Spanish monarchy saw this as an opportunity to solidify their own power nationally throughout Spain, right? Because we're still dealing in an area of time, a period of time when you don't have absolutist monarchs. So they don't control everything in society like they would later on, monarchs would later on in Europe in the 17th century. So, this is an opportunity for them for Fernando and Isabel to gain control, if you will, or at least have an influence in other areas of Spain, which might not have they might not have had as much power in.
And I think all of that makes sense and I think it's crucial for people to understand the historical backdrop, because, think about 700 plus years it took Spain to kick the Muslims back out. They had basically taken over all of Spain, except for a couple, little places up in northern Spain where some people held out and eventually started fighting back, and then more and more. And 700 years later, they finally got their country back. That's a long time. And now there's possible threats of more Muslim invasions. I could be wrong. You can correct me if I am, but I heard that, the people were worried whether it was true or not about a possible assassination of the king and queen. And, if Muslims weren't really Catholic, if they were really Muslims, but pretending to be Catholic, like you said, if there was an uprising, they would join in, unlock the gates, assassinate the powers to be. That's scary, so, they want to know at this point, okay, who's authentically Catholic and who's just faking it, right? So it's not like, oh, we don't like you being Muslim, so we're going to persecute you. We just want to know who's Catholic. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a fair presentation. And to jump on that a little bit more, right? That you bring up a good point, that the Inquisition in Spain, and even the medieval inquisitors, to go back in time to talk about them, right? An inquisitor only had jurisdiction over practicing Catholics, right? The Inquisition was never about going after, if you will, people who were of different faiths, right? People who were actively Jewish or actively Muslim. He had no jurisdiction because the Inquisition was charged with reviewing and with investigating heresy. And what is heresy, right? Heresy is, as defined by the Church's Code of Canon Law, it's an obstinate post-baptismal denial of a doctrine. Right. So it's post-baptismal, meaning you have to be baptized Christian in order to legally be a heretic. Right. A Jew is not a heretic. A Muslim is not a heretic. A heretic is someone who is baptized Christian, who then obstinately does not believe in a doctrine of the church.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the biggest myths that people purport online in person, is that it killed Protestants by the truckloads. It killed Muslims and Jews by the truckloads. And the Inquisition was not about killing other religions or having anything to do with other religions per se. It was really about Catholics. And I think that's really important for people to know. So the Spanish Inquisition, was it started by the Pope or the Vatican? You said the king and queen started it, right?
Yeah, so King Fernando and Queen Isabel petitioned the Pope Sixtus IV to grant the authority to establish an institutional tribunal in Spain that would investigate heresy, right? And the Pope granted that request to the King and Queen, and allowed for the appointment of inquisitors to the tribunal to the crown. So the crown had virtually complete control of the Inquisition in Spain. So this was really a political organization, or I should say it was an organization or institution that was controlled politically by the crown. There was even instances of reports of abuse that made its way back to Rome, to the Pope, about things that were going on in the Spanish Inquisition. And he would write letters back to King Fernando, to complain about it. And Fernando wrote this very famous letter back to the Pope, kind of being dismissive of him, like, you gave me authority to run this in my country, and why are you bothering me now with all these different complaints? This is my gig, so to speak. And so again, it just illustrates it blows through one aspect of that myth, that the Inquisition was somehow this secret cabal of bureaucrats, if you will, in the Vatican or Rome, or controlling everything within Europe, which is completely not true.
And in fact, they were trying to correct any any abuses that had happened and things that went wrong, and they were trying to make sure it went the way it should be. And so that's very interesting. So when they had the Inquisition, was it just what exactly was the Inquisition? How did they go through it? Was it just a bunch of monsters who interrogated these people and threw them into prison for long periods of time and let rats eat away at them? Like, what actually happened?
Yes. Yeah, the image of rats eating away. But no, so the Inquisition, it depends. I mean, we talk about the Spanish Inquisition. So the procedures that the Inquisitors followed were established first by the medieval Inquisitors in the 13th century. And frankly, they were still held to in the Spanish Inquisition with modification, obviously. But the general principle was that, you had these Inquisitors who were charged with investigating heresy. They did so under inquisitorial procedure, meaning someone is accused of heresy. In the way that usually this would operate in the beginning was Inquisitors, when they were itinerant, they would go to a certain area where heresy was suspected. They would preach, they would celebrate Mass, they would announce their presence to everybody in the town, and then they would institute what was called a period of grace. And that period of grace was either anywhere from 30 to 40 days, depended. And that basically was a period of self-incrimination, where people could come before the Inquisition and say, I attended this, Albigensian ceremony where they were talking about various aspects of the faith. They doubted that Jesus, or they told me that Jesus was not really true God and true man. He was just some kind of spirit that appeared to be man. And it seemed plausible to me, so I believe that. But I'm now here to say that that's not true. I don't believe that anymore, kind of thing. So you could self-incriminate. And if you did, then you would be given usually a light penitential sentence of some form, either prayer, fasting, almsgiving, whatever kind of penitential sentence, and then you'd be on your way, if you will. But after the period of self-incrimination, or period of grace, was a time of accusation. So others could come before the Inquisitors and accuse you, or accuse someone of being a heretic. And if when that accusation was brought, then the Inquisitors would send a warrant for that person to come before the tribunal and answer questions that they would pose the individual about their beliefs. And if there was sufficient evidence to determine that the person was suspected of heresy, then they would be arrested. They would be put into an ecclesiastical jail. And so one comment on that during this time in Europe, throughout these centuries, there was basically there were two courts of law, or many different courts of law, but there were, in essence, for our purposes, two courts of law: a secular court and then the ecclesiastical or church court. And both of these courts had their own form of law, their own form of punishment as well, associated with violations of the law. And then both actually operated a penal system as well, right? A way to imprison people. So there were church courts, and there were secular court, or there were church jails and secular jails as well. So someone accused of heresy would be, and it was suspected of heresy, if there was enough evidence that warranted a trial, person would be arrested, placed into the ecclesiastical jail. Their possessions would be confiscated and inventoried by the Inquisition. If they were later on acquitted, then they would be released. Their property would be given back as well. But while they're in the ecclesiastical jail, then, they were brought before the Inquisitors, asked questions, witnesses were brought forth. They were allowed to submit a list of witnesses as well that could, corroborate their testimony that they were not a heretic. And they would also be given, or they were allowed the opportunity to give a list of enemies to the Inquisitors as well. So if there was, somebody who came before the Inquisitors and said, I saw Brian walk into this Albigensian house, and so he's obviously a heretic. But then the Inquisitor, but Brian, you submit a list to them of your enemies, and Steve's at the top of the list, and the Inquisitors review Steve's testimony, and they say, oh, Steve is saying that Brian's a heretic. Well, they would throw that out. So my testimony in that case wouldn't be allowed because, we had some issue with each other. And so they would really try to get to through these procedures and processes, they would try to get through the truth of whether or not someone actually did and obstinately hold to, a false doctrine, right, was actually a heretic. So it was a very just process, frankly, and there were multiple opportunities provided throughout the process for someone who was believing in heretical doctrine, to recant and to repent of that belief, and to be catechized and instructed in the Orthodox faith, and be able to embrace it and accept it and be welcomed back into communion as well.
So it wasn't just a witch hunt, so to speak, where they just hunt people down and really just try to find every possible thing to make sure they're guilty and to make sure they convert and under torture. It sounds like it was a very fair trial. And I like that you said that there were two different types of courts. I don't think people understand that the Inquisition is just a court of law. That's all it is. Like we have today, we have courts. Are they evil? Of course. Well, that's debatable, but we have courts of law that are supposed to be just today. And in the ancient days, they had courts of law too, secular and ecclesiastical, as you said. And if I'm not mistaken, I've heard many times over that the inquisitions of the Catholic Church or the ecclesiastical courts were far more fair than the secular courts of the day. And some people wanted to get transferred over to the ecclesiastical courts so they could have fair trials. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, the ecclesiastical courts of the day were well known to be more fair and just than secular courts. We even have recorded instances of people, especially in Spain, accused of secular crime in secular jail, who then, while they're in secular jail, blaspheme or utter some form of heretical doctrine so that they could be remanded to the Inquisition to be placed in the ecclesiastical jail, because there they were treated more fairly and were given better food and better conditions, if you will. So you have that difference in the courts, and the punishment, as I mentioned too, was different, right? So another thing that many people misunderstand about heresy at the time is that heresy, and this is very difficult for people in modern pluralistic, especially democracies, to understand, right? We live in a modern age that believes in pluralism, that people can believe what they want to believe, even to their own detriment, if you will, and that's just kind of normal, right? So I can be walking down the street and talking, or I can be working with somebody who's a Methodist, who's a Jew, who's a Muslim, who's a Buddhist, whatever. It doesn't matter, right? In our society, that's what we believe. But in Western Europe and Christendom during these centuries, that was a completely and absolutely foreign concept, right? For society to be a multicultural, if you will, or not even multicultural, but multi-diverse in terms of pluralistic society in terms of religion, was completely foreign to people living during these centuries. So for them, the faith was a unifying aspect, not only personally, but communally as well. And so anything that threatened the faith, or threatened the unity of the church, or threatened the unity of the Catholic faith, was really an attack not just on the faith, but an attack on society and the unity of society as a whole. So the secular authorities and spiritual authorities were very much concerned about heresy, but concerned about it from different perspectives, right? Spiritual authority is concerned about heresy because those who believe it place their souls in danger of eternal damnation. And their teachings can spread and place the souls of other people, right, in the danger of eternal damnation. So the church, in her charity, is concerned about people's eternity and wants to make sure that that you are believing faithfully and believing in what will eventually get you, right, hopefully welcome you into the beatific vision, that you'll spend eternity with God. That's the concern of the church.
So they care for their souls.
Right. They care for the souls and the state of their souls. And so that's the spiritual understanding, right? So every penalty or punishment associated with an ecclesiastical crime like heresy is oriented towards that goal, if you will. So from the ecclesiastical perspective, the punishment would be excommunication, right? You're excommunicated from the church. You're declared to be outside of the communion of the church, unable to receive the sacraments. And it's designed to, in essence, be a wake-up call to that individual that you cannot receive grace from the sacraments, and you're placing your soul in danger by believing falsely. And so that's the spiritual perspective. The secular perspective, again, heresy was seen as a threat to the unity of society. And if you look back at the history of heresy in particular, you see that heresy always produces violence. Sometimes that's violence by heretics directed against Catholics or others. Sometimes it's even heresy or violence of Catholics directed against heretics, right? That the people take it upon, not ordered by the church or what have you, but the people take it upon themselves because they feel threatened, because because they are afraid at this danger, they react, and they can react violently, and they did so at times. And so that would cause bloodshed and violence, and secular rulers don't want that. They're charged with peace and unity and security in their territories. And so for them, heresy was a crime because it was a violation of the unity of society, and it was a threat to society. And so secular authorities, right, they want to enforce peace, they want to enforce unity that way, they want to enforce security. So anything that disrupts that is treated more harshly than other kinds of crimes. And so heresy was considered to be a capital crime under the secular authorities, and it was punishable by death. Whereas on the ecclesiastical side, if you will, the canon law forbid the granting or the giving of the punishment of death for any crime. So heresy was not punishable by death under the ecclesiastical courts, but it was punishable by death in secular courts.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. So you're saying that the Catholic Church didn't kill people in the Inquisitions? I mean, because that's one, and I know this and I'm being silly, but
right.
That's one of the biggest things that many people think is that the Catholic Church persecuted and killed people by millions, in fact, tens of millions, in fact, hundreds. I mean, it depends on the source you'll look at, but hundreds of millions by some accounts. And you're saying that the Catholic Church's punishment was excommunication and not death. And did that hold true for the king and queen as well?
No, not for the king and queen. I mean, so what would happen in this process we were talking about earlier is that one who is accused of heresy, who's then adjudged to be obstinate in their heretical belief, so given multiple opportunities to recant, to repent, to reform, to come back to communion, refuses to do so, then the inquisitors would have then declared the person to be obstinate in their heresy, and then would have excommunicated them, and then remanded them to the state. Okay. In essence, saying there's nothing more the church can do, right, for you. We've highlighted that you've placed your soul in danger, highlighted that you're believing something heretical. You've explained why that is heretical, given you opportunities to recant, repent, reform. You've refused to do so, remand you to the state. So the state would then pass judgment on the heretic, and again, under secular law, heresy was a capital offense and punishable by death. So the secular authorities would then declare the person to be a heretic as well, and then would put that person to death. So the church never did that, never put anybody to death. Now, did the church know when they remanded somebody to the state that more than likely that heretic would be condemned and die? Yes. And they tried the inquisitors in particular, tried vehemently to ensure that didn't happen. And when you read their writings, they recognize that if that occurred, then they had failed in their job. They had failed in their duty. Their duty was not to bring about the death of the heretic, but to highlight the danger the heretic was placing themselves in, and to bring about their conversion and reform. And when that didn't happen, it really, it was seen again as a failure on their part.
So the Catholic Church didn't kill anybody. The Pope didn't go around killing people. The priests didn't kill people. The bishops didn't kill people. And in fact, we have to remember, and I think it's important just to remind our viewers here, that the Inquisition wasn't started by the Vatican. It was started by the King and Queen of Spain, who asked the Pope to send theologians because they're not theologians. They can't detect heresy. So these people were just working for the King and Queen, but didn't kill them themselves. And if we could talk about torture for a second, because most people have the idea that everybody was tortured. You have the Monty Python in your head and dungeons and people just screaming. And it was a hideous sight. In fact, you have lots of revisionist histories and online pages that present all these different tortures and mythological things that probably never happened. So maybe you could talk about the torture for a second, because I think torture and killing are two of the biggest things that people misunderstand.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. And I mean, if you go into Google, right, and you go into images and type in Inquisition, you get all these pictures, these old, 19th century woodcuts, if you will, and engravings of, hooded monks with these, heretics on various torture devices, wheels of torture, or the Iron Maiden, or all these other kinds of things that are going on. And so, yeah, we have to understand, right, that torture, first of all, again, going back into understanding jurisprudence at the time, torture was allowed as a means to elicit confession in both secular and ecclesiastical courts at the time. But with the caveat that for inquisitors in particular, The first officially, papally appointed inquisitors were in the year 1231, and it wasn't until about 20 years after that that a later pope actually agreed to the allowance of the use of torture in ecclesiastical tribunals of the in the Inquisition. So it wasn't something that was initially a part of the inquisitorial process, as it was in secular courts. It was used very frequently for all kinds of different reasons in secular courts, but not so in ecclesiastical courts. Eventually, it was allowed, but there were certain conditions placed upon it, which did not happen in ecclesiastical courts, which were not present in secular courts. So what were some of these conditions? Well, in many cases, especially in the Spanish Inquisition, the torture session could only last for 15 minutes. So we're not talking about days or hours or weeks or months on end where you're torturing somebody. It could, which is usually the vision people have.
Yep.
It could only be done for 15 minutes. It could only be done once. So it was kind of a last resort, if you will, a method. The instruments of torture were always shown to the individual first, before they were actually utilized in order to help, which was designed to try to get the person to, confess and not undergo torture, if you will. It was also never inflicted, the torture was never inflicted upon the individual by a cleric. So the monk or the inquisitor, whoever, usually these were clerics, priests, not monks, but they would not, they themselves did not do the torture, if you will. They didn't perform it. It was done by a secular official. In many cases, you had to have a secular representative as well as another ecclesiastical representative present during the torture sessions. They were all carefully recorded as well. It could never result in loss of life or limb. Certain groups of people were always prohibited from being tortured. So, for example, children or young adults, pregnant women, the elderly. There was all groupings of different of these kinds of peoples that were could never be used to torture, even if the inquisitor wanted to do so. And again, many inquisitors didn't like to do it, didn't like to resort to torture at all. One of the most famous inquisitors, Bernard Guy, didn't like torture at all. Infrequently used it or resorted to it. Didn't think it was beneficial. Thought that the confession that was elicited was only given because the individual wanted the torture to stop, which makes sense. And to that point, that if someone did confess under torture, then that was written down, it was recorded, but then the next day, they had to then affirm and confirm or verify that confession outside of torture to ensure that it actually was a real confession and not given just because they wanted the torture to stop, if you will. So torture was not something that, again, I mentioned that many of the inquisitors liked to use, and in many studies that I've seen, the statistics, there was somewhat kind of hard to come to an understanding on, but for the most part, right, the best studies have shown that in less than 2% of cases was torture ever really utilized, especially by the medieval inquisitors. Perhaps a little bit more, up to 5% or so, with cases in the Spanish Inquisition. But still, even if you take that higher estimate, the 95% of the cases brought before an inquisitor never resulted in torture.
Wow. So that's literally the opposite of what our culture and our revisionist history teaches. And so it's interesting that, so they only could be tortured once. Very interesting. You can't keep torturing them. And it's for a very short amount of time. And it's only a select amount of healthy people. It couldn't be children or pregnant women or elderly and different things like that. And they had a lot of rules around it in order to help. I mean, if the person doesn't give up once, they can't do it again and again and again and again and again, which seems to be the understanding by most people. So this is literally like a bomb on our modern culture that people do not understand. It's literally the opposite of what many people think in even many textbooks, in schools. And I tell people that I used to correct textbooks all the time because I was like, this isn't accurate. This isn't accurate. And people think that just because it's in a book or something means it's true, right? I mean, I remember when I was a teacher, I used to correct people because the books in schools all used to say that people in the Middle Ages all believed the earth was flat. And I said, that's that's fake. That's not true. I said the Pope I believe it was the 13th century, if I'm not mistaken, predicted the circumference of the world. And he was pretty close, and he didn't have any of our technology that we have today. And there were people centuries before him who believed that the earth was round. So I remember I was in those schools long enough to see when they changed the books. They took out that fact, they stopped printing that, and they said, oh no, people back in the day actually did believe the earth was round in a lot of cases. So I just want people to know that revisionist history is real, and many people fall for it at the highest levels. And just so you don't have to take our word for it, versus their word for it, I want to talk about primary sources, because I think that is the biggest thing that champions the Catholic cause. Many books have been written using the primary sources, including this book, which is the Spanish Inquisition, a historical revision in a good way, a revision of the revision. And we'll just say, maybe you could talk about this, but the archives of the Vatican were opened, right? And the secret archives of the Vatican, they allowed historians to peruse, read whatever they wanted, and they found a lot of information on the Inquisition. And apparently the inquisitors kept meticulous records, so we don't have to guess at what they thought, at what they did. It's all been there for us to see, as if they wrote a book on it from eyewitnesses. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah, sure. One point on the book that you brought up there, Henry Kamen's The Spanish Inquisition, Historical Revision, fantastic book. That's probably the best book out on the Spanish Inquisition as a whole. And Henry Kamen, he's no Catholic scholar, and he's, is my understanding, he's a Jewish man, British historian who, initially he wrote that book, A Historical Revision, because initially he had, early in his academic career, had kind of believed some of these myths about the Inquisition. And then as he went through his time as an academic and did more and more research, came to understand that it was many of the things he had been taught or he had learned were not accurate. And so he revised some of his work that he had written previously on the Spanish Inquisition. So fantastic resource, highly recommend that, where he looks at primary sources. Another historian that's very good to look at here in this area is Edward Peters. Edward Peters has used to teach University of Pennsylvania. He wrote a book on torture, and he wrote a book on just the Inquisition as a whole and understanding the myth of the Inquisition and where it developed and how it developed over time, and what it really actually was. So two very good top-notch scholars utilizing these primary sources. And you mentioned the Vatican archives. There's certain elements of the so-called secret archives that have been opened, certain centuries and certain things are not. But yeah, researchers, historians can go research in the Vatican archives to find things. Many of the inquisitorial transcripts and other, court proceedings and documents are not contained in the Vatican archives, right? They're contained in national archives in other parts of Europe. So in, the French National Archives, if you wanted to go look at institutional or inquisitional records from periods of time in French history, you would go there. You would go the same thing in Spain and various archives throughout there, other archives in Italy. So not everything was consolidated and brought centrally to Rome. But if you wanted to investigate the Roman Inquisition in their archives, obviously you would utilize the archives and the library and the Vatican for those. So, and these are, like you mentioned, these are open. This is, anybody can, not anybody, but researchers, historians can go and have access to some of these centuries old documents and review them. And, this was a court proceeding. So just like as now we have stenographers and in the courtrooms that, keep meticulous notes of what everybody said and when they said it and who said what, very similar back in the time of the medieval inquisitors and the Spanish Inquisition in particular. Meticulous notes were kept, not only of the court proceedings and of the questions that were asked by the inquisitors, the responses given by the accused. Even, as I mentioned, the torture sessions, were recorded, and what was done, when it was done, what the person said. All of this is recorded to be able to go back and review it. And like you said, don't have to make it up. You can read word for word what actually occurred in these things. But that always doesn't necessarily make for the salacious headline or the blockbuster Hollywood movie. So the myth has been created about these events in order to further a different agenda, if you will.
Yeah, and they've been repeated over and over and over since the Protestants, since the Protestants who wanted to slander the Catholic Church, and they made up, just vile stuff. Whole imaginations of what might have gone on, except that they didn't really know. And many of these things have been passed down through the centuries. But what I love about this is that this is actual historical primary documents that most anyone can see, or you can, study the people who have seen it firsthand. And it demolishes the myths against the Catholic Church. It demolishes that the Catholic Church was a killing machine. And it shows that the trials were incredibly fair, incredibly precise, incredibly charitable. And in fact, many people were exonerated who might not have been otherwise. And if I'm not sure where I heard this, it might have been your talk or someone else's talk. I mean, I've studied so many books and things, but I've heard of inquisitors reaching out to secular courts and telling them that this person's innocent. You need to, fix your proceedings or send them over here or something. And they tried to help exonerate other people as well. So it really goes against this picture that the Catholic Church was a killing machine, which just is 100% false. And so maybe we could talk about it, because some people say 50 million people were killed. Other people, like David Hunt, I think, says 90 or 99 million people were killed. Others say it's over 100 million people were killed. I mean, is that even possible?
Yeah, no, the numbers for this are, as you mentioned, right, in various different sources are widely exaggerated. And again, I think that's done by design, right? Because many of the people who are presenting these arguments and coming up with these falsification of numbers, if you will, they have their own agenda. They have their own animus against the church and against the church's influence in society, or they want to lessen the church's influence in society. So they utilize these historical events as a club, if you will, to beat the church up with. And so, reliable historians, and you look at the different estimates they have come up with in terms of how many numbers of people were remanded to the state and how many executions there may have been in the Spanish Inquisition. Let's say, for example, where the most infamous and evil institution that's been portrayed in our society. In the height of the Spanish Inquisition, from the 15th century to the middle part of the 16th century, Henry Kamen, I believe it was, estimated 2,000 people were remanded to the state. So that's about 40 a year, and far less, a very small percentage, maybe 2% or so, definitely less than 5% of the numbers of cases that were brought before the inquisitors. So this is not, the tens of thousands or the millions of people, being remanded to the state and executed, even during the medieval period of time. There were far more people that were killed for heresy by either secular lords or just by people who were reacting to, an alleged presence of a heretic in their midst, than were actually, investigated, if you will, by the church and remanded to the state. So very few of the cases, again, as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of cases were ended in some sense either with acquittal or with a confession of the accused, who was then given some form of penance, and the penances varied depending upon who the person was, and meaning what their status was in life. So, a poor individual who confessed and who repented and was given a penance would receive a lesser penance, if you will. Wouldn't be told to, go fund the construction of a bridge or something, or go fund construction of a church. Whereas a rich person, who had the same situation or accused of a heresy, might be given that penance. So, penances were applicable to your status in life, if you will. But you were given a penance, and that was it. And sometimes those penances would last for a long period of time. In Spain, it was not uncommon for the penance of the San Benito to be given, which was a penitential garment that the repentant penitent, or the repentant heretic, had to wear publicly for a number of, it could be months, could be years. But then when that time came for them to take off the garment, they had served their penance, if you will. It was a time of great joy and celebration in that person's life, obviously. But it was a physical reminder, an outward reminder of every time they had to go outside their house of wearing this garment. And, a sign not only for them, but for society as well. And the harm, really, that people believed at the time that heresy and false belief actually contributed to the disunity of society.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. Complete opposite of the secular courts, which didn't, as you said, didn't have the rules, and so killed a lot more people, tortured a lot more people. Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting. I thought Patrick Madrid had a brilliant point in his book, Pope Fiction, which I think I have right behind me, actually. And he says it's impossible that 50 million people were killed, which is a common Protestant assertion, anti-Catholic assertion, because he says there weren't even that many people in Europe at the time. Thanks to the bubonic plague and the Black Death, there were half of Europe was slaughtered by that plague. And so in order to kill 50 million people, he said you would have had to kill every man, woman, and child, and then import a whole lot more and then kill all of them too. He said the number is just ludicrous. And that's not even talking about the many sources that's about 100 million or 150 million and, blood-bathed streets and things like that. This is why we're doing this video. This is why we're doing this podcast, because we want people to know the truth. And last thing I want to talk about is that I think it's important to know is that when the Salem witch trials came about, and this swept like a craze through Europe and, different places, and people were just on a witch hunt, the Catholic Church didn't get caught up in that, did they? And it was because of the Inquisition and the fair, rational proceedings that they had already taking place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the witch craze that kind of swept through Europe, really the height of it, if you will, came more in towards that. Well, I shouldn't even say the height, even the beginnings of it really didn't happen until the mid 15th century. Not to say that there weren't issues with witches or people accusing other people of being witches, prior to that time there was, but the kind of the focus on witches or witchcraft or wizardry and sorcery and that kind of stuff by secular courts really kind of began in the 15th and then, hit the height, if you will, in the 17th century, the 1600s, and even as you move into the 18th century a bit as well. So, but yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, the medieval inquisitors really were instructed to not have anything to do with any witches or wizards or sorcery or any accusations of that, unless it also involved an accusation of heresy. So unless a witch or was believed to have uttered something heretical or was a heretic or promulgating false doctrine of some sense, the inquisitors would have nothing to do with it. That's a secular matter. The secular people, secular authorities, and secular courts would handle it. In Spain, you even have examples in Spain in the Spanish Inquisition where inquisitors actually saved women, if you will, or saved those who were accused of witchcraft. There's one instance where a local inquisitor bandied together with the secular authorities in the region. 7 women were accused of being witches, were condemned when their case went up to the higher court, so the court of appeal, if you will, in the Spanish Inquisition. The inquisitor there realized that this was, not something that was appropriate and something that the Inquisition itself shouldn't be dealing with. He traveled to the town to tell the magistrates, the local authorities there. He actually removed the local inquisitor because he had allowed this to happen, replaced him with someone else, and then talked with the local magistrates and local authorities to exonerate these women, or at least from the charge of witchcraft. Sadly, he got there a little bit late, and some of them actually had been killed by the secular authorities before he got there. But the others who were still alive, were spared because of his intervention. So this was something, this witchcraft craze and wizardry and sorcery, all that kind of stuff, was not something that the church dealt with within the Inquisition itself, right? And as you point out, the Inquisition was a fair process that had very specific legal procedures in place with a very specific charge, right, to investigate heresy. And if there wasn't witchcraft, it was not necessarily, again, not until you get to the 15th century even, was it considered to have anything to do with heresy. And even then, there was a lot of argument and debate within ecclesial circles whether witchcraft posed, some form of heresy or not. So there was no uniformity in that belief either. But the kind of craze that happens later on in the 16th century and the 17th century is predominantly, frankly, in Protestant areas, and in some Catholic areas of what is modern day Germany as well. So, but it wasn't, there are some areas of Christendom that didn't have any there was no witch craze, if you will, right? In Italy, for example, you don't find real instances of that. In some regions of France, in particular, Eastern Europe, almost as a whole, this was non-existent. This really was much more rooted in Protestant areas, especially in Protestant England. And so that's why you have that in Salem. And when English settlers come to the New World, you begin to have the witch craze and witch trials here in the United States. That's from an English Protestant influence, not at all from the church.
And do you know if the Protestants killed a lot of witches at that time?
Yeah, I mean, one estimate I've seen, at least throughout Europe, throughout the centuries, was anywhere from, it's tens of thousands, 30 to 50,000 or so individuals may have been killed by secular authorities, accused of witchcraft and whatnot. So obviously significantly more than the numbers who were remanded by the Spanish Inquisition to the secular authorities, for heresy.
So interesting. So interesting on so many different levels. And if you guys would like to learn more about the Inquisition, you can check out Steve's books, and we're going to link those at the in this podcast down below. We will link your website and some of your information down below so people can find your work and a lot of what you do. In fact, I think he has a CD specifically called The Real Story of the Inquisition, where he gives a lot of these facts and a lot of this information. And so if you want to know more about the Inquisition, you can check out Steve and his work. Thank you so much, Steve, for being on this show today. We really, really are glad that you were here with us.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, for the opportunity to talk about this most misunderstood historical event. So blessings to you and your family.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And again, check out Steve's new book, Light from Darkness. 9 times the Catholic Church was in turmoil and came out stronger than before. And we're going to come out stronger again because Christ guides his church. And thank you all for watching today. We thank you all for supporting this channel. Thank you for our patrons and those who support us through their prayers. If you would like to follow us, check out our description section below. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram and Pinterest and other social media platforms below. And you can check out our information and what we do below, and check out our website as well at thecatholictruth.org. If you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments section below. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at our website. And if you would give this video a thumb up and also share it with as many people as humanly possible to undo the revisionist history that we have going on. I mean, the myths have been repeated. We need to undo that and start repeating what the truth actually is. So please share this with everybody you know and continue praying for us as we're always praying for you. Thank you all, and God bless you.